It was a bright, sunny day, and the city was bustling with tourists from all over the world. The streets were alive with chatter, laughter, and the sound of camera shutters clicking away as people marveled at the sights around them. Among the many groups of visitors was a lively group of friends, filled with excitement and wonder as they explored the famous landmarks of the city. Today they were visiting one of the most iconic spots, the Royal Palace, home to centuries of history and tradition. The group consisted of John, Emma, and their close friends, Sarah and Ben. They were all in their early 20s, full of energy and a sense of adventure. This was their first big trip abroad, and they had planned it for months. The history, the culture, and the chance to experience something truly royal had them all buzzing with anticipation. As they wandered through the grand gates of the palace, the towering stone walls seemed to whisper stories of kings and queens from ages long past. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, and they couldn't wait to explore every corner. One thing that immediately caught their attention was the sight of the royal guards standing at attention in front of the palace gates. Dressed in their iconic uniforms, perfectly pressed and immaculately presented, the guards looked like statues, standing completely still with their rifles by their sides. To most people, the sight of these stoic soldiers was an impressive display of discipline. To John, however, it seemed almost silly. How do they stand there all day without moving? John said, staring at one of the guards. I could totally do that. How hard can it be? His voice was filled with playful mockery, but his friends, caught up in the excitement of the moment, agreed with him, laughing. Emma, always ready for a little fun, nudged John. Maybe we should try to make them move. What if we wave in front of them, or say something silly? They can't be that serious, can they? Sarah and Ben giggled, imagining the reaction of the guards if they actually tried something like that. John, being the most daring of the group, began to suggest all sorts of challenges. I bet if we walk right up to them and do something outrageous, they'll blink or laugh. They're just standing there, like robots. Ben raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? These guys are supposed to be pretty serious. You might get in trouble. But John wasn't listening. He was too caught up in the challenge. Oh, come on, it'll be fun. How can they not react? He said confidently, grinning at his friends. They continued to observe the guards, who stood perfectly still, their faces unreadable and their postures stiff with discipline. As the group approached the gates, the thought of testing the guards' patience seemed more like an entertaining idea than a risky one. Little did they know, they were about to find out just how serious those guards truly were. John's excitement grew with every step as he continued to eye the royal guards. He couldn't help but feel a sense of challenge in the air. I'm telling you, it's too easy, he said, grinning broadly as he nudged Emma. There's no way they'll stand there without reacting if we do something fun. Emma raised an eyebrow, unsure of how far John was willing to go, but the playful energy in the air made it hard to resist. You're really going to do it, huh? All right, I'm in, but we have to make it funny. She giggled, already imagining the reactions the guards might have. The rest of the group, still unsure but caught up in the energy of the moment, began to laugh and egg them on. Come on, John, show us what you've got. You're always talking about how you can get anyone's attention, Sarah said, her voice filled with amusement. Ben, who was always a little more cautious, crossed his arms, still uncertain. You're really going to mess with them? I mean, this is a royal palace. But John was too focused on his plan to listen to Ben's warnings. Don't worry, they'll laugh, and we'll all have a good story to tell, he said confidently, as if it was the easiest thing in the world. He took a deep breath and began to slowly approach the first guard. He moved carefully, as though trying to avoid making a sound, but with every step, his heart raced a little faster. There was something thrilling about the idea of getting close to the stoic guards, even if it was a little reckless. As John came closer, he waved his hand in front of the guard's face. The guard didn't even flinch, his eyes focused straight ahead, his posture as rigid as ever. John stepped back for a moment, waiting for some reaction. There was nothing. The guard remained completely still. John, undeterred, took a few steps closer and began to make silly faces at him, sticking out his tongue and pulling exaggerated expressions. Emma and Sarah laughed behind him, whispering to each other. "He's really going for it," Sarah whispered, barely able to hold back her laughter. John, now feeling even bolder, turned around to face his friends. "See, easy," he said, still smiling, though there was a flicker of doubt in his mind. "Let me try something else. I'll bet I can make him blink. Watch this." He took a few steps closer, now standing right in front of the guard. He began hopping around, making exaggerated jumping movements and waving his arms wildly, like a person trying to get the attention of a distracted child. The more he moved, the more confident he became. The guard didn't respond. He didn't even look down at John's antics. It was like John wasn't even there. At this point, Emma and Sarah were almost in stitches. They whispered to Ben, "It's like the guard doesn't even care. This is ridiculous." But John wasn't about to give up. He took a step back, then pretended to trip, almost falling dramatically onto the ground in a way that would normally draw attention. He looked up at the guard, expecting a blink, a twitch, or at least a sign that his performance had been noticed. But nothing happened. The guard was as unmoving and calm as ever, his eyes locked straight ahead. For a moment, John stood there, staring at the guard, wondering if maybe he had underestimated the seriousness of this whole thing. The excitement of the challenge started to wear off, replaced by the realization that these guards were much more disciplined than he had given them credit for. But instead of backing down, John just shrugged and turned to his friends with a playful grin. "Well, I'm not giving up yet. Let's see if I can really get them to crack." As John continued his antics, the rest of the group watched with a mixture of amusement and growing concern. Emma, who had been laughing just moments before, started to feel a little uneasy. "John, I think you've had enough. They're not even looking at you. Maybe it's time to back off," she said, her tone softening as she began to realize that the situation was taking a turn. John, however, wasn't listening. He was too caught up in the challenge. "No way. I'm not done yet," he said with a wink, turning back toward the guards. He was determined to get a reaction, no matter what it took. He took a few more steps forward, his eyes fixed on the guard in front of him. But this time, something felt different. There was an air of tension around the guards that John hadn't noticed before. The other tourists who had been passing by seemed to be taking notice as well. A few of them gave John curious looks, but no one seemed willing to speak up. It wasn't like they hadn't seen people try to get reactions from the guards before, but there was something about the way John was acting now that made it feel more risky. The area had started to feel a little more serious, and the sounds of laughter and playful chatter were beginning to fade into the background. Emma looked around nervously, her eyes flicking between John and the royal guards. She noticed a couple of bystanders watching them, shaking their heads slightly as if they were silently warning John to stop. One man, an older local, caught her eye and walked over to them. His face was serious, and his voice was low but firm. "You should stop," he said, glancing toward the guards before looking directly at John. "These men are not here for your entertainment. They are very serious about their job. You're pushing it." His words made Emma feel uneasy, and she noticed that some of the other tourists around them were starting to stare. John looked at the man, a little surprised by the warning. "What are you talking about?" "We're just having some fun," he said, still not understanding how serious the situation could be. The older man sighed and shook his head, clearly not wanting to get involved any further. "They don't joke around. If you're not careful, you could get into trouble," the man said, his voice tinged with warning. John's confident smile faded slightly, but he shrugged it off. "Come on, it's fine. They're just standing there. They can't possibly be that serious about it." He waved the concern away as if it was nothing. But Emma, sensing the tension building around them, couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a line. As the man walked away, She turned to John with a more serious expression. "Maybe we should stop now. I'm starting to feel like we're pushing them a little too much." John didn't respond immediately. He had been so focused on trying to get the guards to react that he hadn't realized how tense things had gotten. He looked over at the guards again and, for the first time, noticed just how unshakable they were. Their eyes didn't move, their bodies didn't shift. They seemed almost like statues, unbothered by the world around them. A sudden feeling of doubt crept into John's mind. He realized that the situation might not be as harmless as he had thought. He looked back at Emma, who was now glancing around nervously, and for the first time, he felt a wave of hesitation. It wasn't just the man's warning. It was the way the entire atmosphere had shifted. The laughter had died down, the bystanders were watching, and the royal guards, though unmoved, seemed to carry an air of authority that John hadn't fully understood until now. Maybe it was time to step back. John stood there for a moment, caught between his stubborn determination and the growing feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had gone too far. The sense of excitement that had fueled his actions earlier began to fade, replaced by a feeling of uncertainty. He glanced at Emma, who was looking at him with a mixture of concern and frustration. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression said it all. It was clear that the fun they were having was starting to feel more like a bad idea. Still, John couldn't help but push forward. His pride was on the line now. He had started this challenge, and he wasn't about to back down just because of a little warning. He gave Emma a small, reassuring smile, but deep down, even he could sense that the situation was starting to take a turn he hadn't expected. With a deep breath, John decided to go even bolder. "All right, fine," he said, trying to sound confident. "Let's see if I can really make one of them blink. If they won't react to me hopping around, maybe I'll do something else." He gave his friends a mischievous grin, his eyes gleaming with determination. He took a few steps forward, his heart pounding. This time, instead of just moving around or making faces, John had a new plan in mind. He thought that maybe if he got really close to one of the guards, he could make them uncomfortable enough to react. So without any hesitation, he moved right up to one of the guards. The guard was standing perfectly still, just like before, and seemed completely unfazed by John's presence. John stood there for a moment, staring up at the guard. He was so close now that he could see every detail of the guard's uniform. The polished buttons, the clean edges, the rigid posture. For a second, John wondered what it must be like to have such discipline, to stand there for hours without moving a muscle. But that thought was quickly brushed away as John's competitive spirit flared up again. He had come this far. He wasn't about to back down now. With a grin, John leaned in closer to the guard and waved his hands directly in front of their face. He waited for a sign. Anything. A blink, a twitch, a change in posture. But the guard remained perfectly still, unmoving, his eyes focused straight ahead. John took a step back, thinking that maybe he hadn't done it right. He had to try something else, something more creative. He jumped in front of the guard, making a dramatic, exaggerated movement with his arms, as if trying to distract him. He even tried talking to the guard, asking in a playful tone, "What's the matter? Can't keep up with me?" But once again, there was no response. Not even the slightest movement. The guard's face was completely neutral, and his eyes didn't flicker for a second. It was almost like John wasn't even there. The silence around them grew louder. Emma, Sarah, and Ben had all stepped back, watching the scene unfold with a mix of amusement and growing concern. Emma crossed her arms and sighed. "John, I don't think this is working. They're just not reacting. Maybe it's time to stop." But John wasn't ready to give up just yet. No, I'm not finished," he said, his voice filled with determination. He took another step forward, his eyes still fixed on the guard. He couldn't understand how they remained so stoic. Didn't they have any sense of humor? Didn't they want to show that they weren't just statues? The more John tried to get them to react, the more fascinated he became by their unyielding composure. As he stood there, feeling the growing tension in the air, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The guards were not only ignoring him, they were also sending a clear message that they weren't to be messed with. John started to wonder if maybe he had underestimated the seriousness of their role. John stood there, staring at the royal guard, his heart racing as he tried to figure out what to do next. No matter how many silly faces he made or how close he got, the guard didn't even flinch. It was like he was invisible. For a moment, John felt the smallest flicker of doubt. Maybe the challenge wasn't as easy as he had thought. The guard's unwavering stillness was beginning to feel more like a silent warning than an invitation to play. The air around them seemed to grow heavier. The other tourists, who had been laughing and chatting just moments ago, had quieted down, sensing that something was changing. A few people were watching them closely now, some whispering to each other, while others seemed to step away, as if they didn't want to be associated with what was happening. Emma's face was filled with concern, and she took a step toward John. "John, I really think we should stop," she said softly, her voice tinged with worry. She could tell that the guards were no longer ignoring John. They were waiting for him to realize that he had crossed a line. The light-hearted atmosphere had faded, replaced by the tension of a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. But John, ever determined, didn't want to admit that he had lost. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He looked over his shoulder at Emma and gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Em. I've got this. I'll try something else." His voice was steady, but Emma could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Just as John was about to take another step, something shifted. One of the other royal guards, who had been standing further back, suddenly began to move. It wasn't an exaggerated movement, but it was enough to make John pause. The guard took a few steps forward and placed himself directly between John and the other guard, creating an even more intimidating presence. John's grin faltered, but he still didn't back away. Instead, he looked at the new guard, trying to figure out what was happening. The guard didn't speak, didn't look at John, but he moved with purpose. His posture was straight, his hands at his sides, and his eyes focused ahead. It was clear that he was standing in a way that made it impossible for John to get any closer without crossing an invisible line. The guard's body language was calm but firm, a silent message that this was not a place for jokes. John could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer about a fun challenge. It was about respect, about understanding the seriousness of the moment. For the first time, he realized how close he had come to overstepping, how his actions had started to disrupt something that was far more important than his personal entertainment. The quiet around him felt louder now, and the weight of the situation began to settle in. Emma, seeing the change in John's expression, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "John," she said softly, "it's not worth it. We don't want to get into trouble." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of understanding. She knew that John was stubborn, but she also knew that there was no fun to be had here anymore. The challenge wasn't fun anymore. It was a game they had lost the moment they decided to push the guards too far. John stood there for a moment, looking at the guard who had stepped in front of him. The new guard's face remained impassive, but John could see the hint of authority in his stance. It wasn't anger, but it was firm. And in that moment, John understood. The guards weren't just part of the palace's show. They were symbols of something much deeper: tradition, discipline, and respect. The energy around them shifted once more, and John finally realized that there was nothing left to prove. He took a deep breath and slowly took a step back, his grin fading as he finally accepted that the game was over. As John stepped back, the tension that had been building around them seemed to ease just a little. He took a deep breath, realizing that the situation had finally gotten serious. His friends, who had been watching with a mixture of amusement and concern, started to relax slightly as well. The guards, though still perfectly composed, didn't show any signs of reacting to John's retreat. They were unmoved, unshaken, and unbothered by anything that had just happened. Emma, who had been the first to suggest they stop, gave John a reassuring smile. "You know, I think you're right. It's probably best to leave it at that," she said, trying to lighten the mood. The tension in her voice had softened, but there was still a trace of unease. She wasn't angry with John, but she was relieved that he had finally realized it was time to stop. John, now a bit embarrassed but also relieved, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you're right. I guess I got carried away," he admitted, his voice a little quieter than before. He glanced over at the guards again, their faces still expressionless, their bodies still standing at attention. The more he looked at them, the more he understood the unspoken rule of the place. The royal guards weren't just a display of tradition. They were a symbol of order and respect, a reminder that some things weren't meant to be joked about or challenged. As the group began to walk away from the gates, they all remained silent for a moment, each of them processing the events that had just unfolded. Ben, who had been the most cautious from the start, broke the silence with a laugh, though it was tinged with a little bit of relief. "Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm glad that's over," he said, shaking his head. "I thought you were really going to push it there for a second, John." John couldn't help but chuckle along with him, though it wasn't the triumphant laughter he had imagined. "Yeah, I thought it was going to be a lot easier than that. Guess I underestimated them," he said, shaking his head in self-mockery. "Those guys are no joke. I mean, they don't even blink. I don't know how they do it." Emma gave him a light nudge. "You were way too determined to get a reaction. It's just not worth it," she said. "You've got to respect the traditions, you know. They're not there for fun. They're there because they have a job to do." John nodded, finally understanding the weight of what he had been doing. "I get it now. I definitely crossed a line," he admitted. "I was just trying to get a laugh, but it wasn't the right place for that." He sighed, realizing that his playful challenge had unintentionally disrespected something important. As they continued to walk, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal. The group began talking again, but the earlier sense of carefree fun had faded. They were no longer the group of friends eager to push boundaries. They had learned, through their own experience, that some things shouldn't be tested. John felt a little wiser for the experience. He'd always been the one to challenge limits and push against the rules, but today had been a lesson in humility. It wasn't just about trying to prove something to his friends or to himself. It was about understanding respect, not just for the guards, but for the traditions they represented. As they reached the exit of the palace, John paused for a moment and glanced back toward the royal guards. This time, there was no urge to challenge them. Instead, he felt a quiet respect. They had remained steady, unwavering, and calm throughout the entire ordeal, and in doing so, had shown him a lesson he wouldn't forget anytime soon. As they made their way out of the palace grounds, the group was quieter than before. The laughter that had filled the air earlier was now replaced with thoughtful silence. Each of them seemed to be lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on what had just happened. John, in particular, felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. It wasn't just about the challenge anymore. It was about realizing how easily he had crossed a line. Emma, walking beside him, glanced over with a soft smile. "It's okay, John. You didn't mean any harm," she said gently, trying to comfort him. But John wasn't entirely convinced. He'd always been the one to push the limits, always looking for a way to make things more exciting, more fun. But this time, it had felt different. This time, he had learned the importance of understanding boundaries. "I know, but still," John said, his voice a little more serious than usual. "I think I might have gone too far. I didn't realize how serious they were about it all. I thought I could just joke around, but I guess there's more to it than that." Emma nodded. "Exactly. Sometimes, when you're caught up in the moment, you forget about the bigger picture. But I think you learned something valuable today." Ben, who had been walking ahead of the group, turned around and gave them a thoughtful look. "I never understood why people mess with the guards in the first place," he said, his voice calm. I mean, they're standing there doing their job, looking serious, and then someone comes along trying to make them break character. It's like, why? John chuckled softly at Ben's words, the tension in his chest slowly easing. Yeah, you're right. I don't know why I thought it would be funny. I guess I just didn't think it through. As they continued to walk down the cobbled streets, the group couldn't help but glance back at the palace walls. The guards were still standing there, just as immovable and stoic as they had been when they first arrived. But now, instead of seeing them as part of a challenge, John saw them as something much more. He realized that their presence was a reminder of something much deeper, of discipline, responsibility, and the importance of tradition. It wasn't about whether or not they reacted to him. It was about the way they embodied a sense of unwavering focus. They weren't there to entertain or be tested. They were there because they had a duty to uphold. The quiet feeling of respect grew inside him as they walked further away. John glanced at his friends, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, that's one for the books, huh?" he said, trying to lighten the mood again. "Not exactly the victory I was hoping for, but I think I got the message." Emma laughed softly. "You sure did. I don't think any of us will be forgetting that lesson anytime soon." As they approached the exit, John found himself feeling a sense of peace. The adrenaline from earlier had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. He had learned something important that day, something beyond just a lesson about the royal guards. It was about knowing when to stop, about understanding that some things were not meant to be tested for fun. It was about respecting the boundaries set by others, and knowing that it was okay to walk away from a challenge when it wasn't the right time. "Thanks for sticking with me, guys," John said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I think I needed a little reminder about respect." Ben smiled, giving him a light slap on the back. "Don't worry, man. We all learn from these things. Just maybe next time, think before you try to mess with a guard." John laughed, the weight lifting from his shoulders. He felt lighter now, as if he had gained a new perspective on things. The lesson he had learned today wasn't just about royal guards. It was about life itself. Some boundaries, when respected, held meaning beyond what words could express, and it was important to acknowledge them. As they left the palace behind, the group continued on their way, their laughter returning slowly, but with a new sense of understanding. As the group walked away from the palace, the final remnants of the tension from earlier were beginning to fade. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the streets. It was a peaceful end to what had started as an exciting and daring challenge. John couldn't help but reflect on the day, on how things had shifted so unexpectedly. It had been one of those rare moments where he had been forced to stop and think, to truly understand the meaning of respect and boundaries. Emma, noticing the thoughtful look on his face, gave him a gentle nudge. "You okay?" she asked with a smile, her voice warm and reassuring. John looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I'm good, just thinking about everything that happened," he said, his tone thoughtful but lighter now. "I guess I didn't really understand what I was doing at first. I just thought it would be a funny challenge, but it turned into something more important." Emma nodded. "Sometimes we don't realize the lessons we're supposed to learn until we're in the middle of something. But that's how life works, right? We make mistakes, learn from them, and grow." Ben, who had been walking beside them, chimed in. "You know, I think we all learned something today. I mean, it's not just about respecting the guards. It's about respecting other people and traditions, too." He paused for a moment, his hands in his pockets as he continued. "It's easy to get caught up in the moment and forget about the bigger picture. But I think today reminded us that we're not always the center of everything. Sometimes we have to step back and just appreciate what's around us." John looked at Ben, feeling a sense of gratitude toward his friend's wise words. "Yeah, I guess I got so focused on trying to get a reaction that I didn't stop to think about the real purpose of those guards. They're not there for entertainment. They're there to do their job, and that deserves respect." The group continued to walk in silence for a while, the peaceful atmosphere surrounding them as they took in the sights of the city. The hustle and bustle of tourists had started to slow down, and the streets were quieter now. They passed through narrow alleys, admiring the old architecture, and slowly the earlier unease faded away completely. It was clear that the day had left an impression on all of them. They had learned more than they expected, and in a way they had also grown a little closer. John knew that this was a moment he wouldn't forget. The lesson had been subtle but meaningful. He had challenged something he didn't fully understand, but in doing so, he had gained a deeper appreciation for the traditions and rules that were in place. He had learned that it wasn't always about winning or being the center of attention. Sometimes, the greatest moments came from simply stepping back and appreciating the world as it was. As the group made their way to a nearby cafe, Emma turned to John with a teasing smile. "So, what's next? Are we going to try to get the attention of some other royal guards, or are you done with challenges for today?" John laughed, feeling the last of the tension lift from his shoulders. "I think I've had enough of challenges for one day," he said with a grin. "But maybe next time, we can just enjoy the moment without trying to mess with anyone." The group laughed together, the carefree joy returning. They found a table at the cafe, ordering drinks and snacks as they sat down to relax. The events of the day seemed distant now, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them for a long time. John looked around at his friends, feeling thankful for their support and understanding. It wasn't just about the royal guards anymore. It was about realizing that some things in life were meant to be respected, and that sometimes the most meaningful moments came from simply taking a step back and letting things be. They had all learned a valuable lesson that day, and it was one they would carry with them as they continued their travels. The sun was setting on the city, and the group was content, knowing that the real victory wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about growing and becoming more aware of the world around them.